If I'd only followed my instincts, I'd never have boarded that doomed ship. When the Azure Sea Star left port, its passengers were all alive, each with smartphones and watches and tablets, as well as the cruise ship's own communications. Yet, not a single message was sent before it went missing. No distress calls. The fates of over 1,000 passengers and crew remain unknown, with only a handful recovered from a lifeboat days after the Sea Star herself vanished. But the Coast Guard's only statement on the lifeboat's recovery was that the passengers did not survive. Rumors circulated about a thermos full of eyeballs and a passenger whose mouth was stuffed full of severed fingers. But these details have been denounced as lies, sensationalizing and capitalizing on a tragedy. The official cause of the Sea Star's disappearance is a rogue wave. No survivors, no witnesses. Well, one witness. But perhaps I shouldn't tell. Better for the world if that ship stays lost forever. The families of the missing, however, deserve the truth. Which is why I'm posting. But first, a warning. The gruesome snippets I recounted above barely scratch the surface of the horror I'm about to share, some of which I took part in. I wake screaming every night. I sleep with the lights on. I never enter darkened hallways or stairwells. And I do not ever shake hands. Although I've always had some quirks, the handshake one is an old habit. Most of these are fresh, a consequence of my time aboard that doomed cruise ship. I do not intend to gloss over any details, but rather to give a complete accounting, including of my own involvement. So be forewarned. And understand that my story is one of unimaginable horror. To explain what really happened aboard the Sea Star, I need to first tell a little about myself. Sorry, I know. I'm like a bit of decorative wallpaper, just sort of there, but I see things. It all started when I was very young. I do promise this is relevant. I didn't want to swim in the community pool with my brother because the water was cloudy, hiding a shadowy figure in the deep end. I distinctly remember standing at the pool's edge, crying uncontrollably while my father urged, "Go on, jump in." My brother set the example, diving down to the bottom of the foggy water. When he came up, a silver dollar glinted in his fingers, which he dropped back into the pool before I could snatch it. "Oops, guess you gotta dive in for it." He laughed, the sun shimmering off his sunburned shoulders. "Come on, there's quarters down here too." Diving for coins was a game we played often, so I plunged in after him, kicking my way down with my eyes squeezed shut. When my hands grazed the rough cement bottom, I padded around. Silky hair tangled around my fingers like seaweed. I forced my eyes open against the stinging chlorine and shrieked. Wide, empty eyes stared back at me from a bloated face. When I shot to the surface wailing about a dead woman in the water, other swimmers looked on, perplexed. My older brother tried to console me and swore there were nothing but coins. He was correct. Not until a week later would a woman drown in that pool and sink to the bottom of the foggy water while swimmers unwittingly raced laps above her. The next time I saw was when I threw a tantrum over my grandmother's armchair. It smelled so bad I grabbed my nose and exclaimed, "Ew!" My parents scolded me for my rudeness. Grandma occasionally struggled with incontinence. So, for her chair to stink was, they assumed, the result of an accident. They thought I was exaggerating to make fun of her, but in the sweltering summer, the smell was truly unbearable. Like rotting meat and diarrhea and cheap perfume all churned together. I threw such a fit, we left, though Grandma insisted on hugging me despite my being an awful brat. Her skin was wrinkled, papery thin, and soft as silk. But, despite the uncomfortable warmth of her apartment, her embrace was ice cold. Less than a week later, the call came. My grandmother had been found after a neighbor's complaint about the smell. She died in her chair. But when the seeing really clicked was in my tween years. 2 separate incidents. The first was after a classmate of my brother's pulled up in a car, reeking of burnt meat. The interior charred in black. He stepped out of the car, seeming not to notice that behind him, another version of him remained belted into the front seat. Unrecognizable through the char, beyond the glint of the gold chain melted into his neck. I burst into hysterical tears and screamed at my brother not to let him drive. The classmate laughed and called me a weirdo. He crashed later that week. The second incident began at a school function where my brother chaperoned me. A man pulled up in the school drop-off zones. He was one of the more popular teachers, famous for his yearly pizza parties. In the car with him were 2 young kids. I can't remember their names, just that the littlest boy was giggling and clinging to a toy T-Rex when he hopped out. My brother and I were asked to help carry the party supplies and drinks from the teacher's car. But the moment I opened the passenger door to grab a box, the reek of fetid pond water made my stomach lurch. I staggered back, clapping a hand to my nose and mouth. "Hey, everything all right?" The teacher asked. My brother, no doubt remembering what happened to his classmate weeks earlier, took me aside. Cold. Dark. The smell. Like the rot in the bottom of a lake. While I wrung my hands and sniffled, my brother watched the 2 young kids follow the teacher into the school. He shook my shoulder and said, Hey, we're going to save them." How? No one ever believes me. I believe you, Hope. Hey. He gave me a squeeze and looked into my eyes. Hope is the thing with feathers. What a dork. That line was from Emily Dickinson. My brother's favorite quote for me for when I was upset. It was corny, but encouraged me. A few minutes later, we were careening along the backwoods roads in the teacher's car. To this day, I don't know how my brother got the keys. His plan was, we'd stow the car in a garage for a couple weeks, long enough to outlast the vision, since my predictions always came true within about 6 days. But it hadn't occurred to either of us how being inside the car would affect me. The damp and rot washed over my skin. Cold. Every hair on my body stood erect, floating as if underwater. I couldn't breathe. Gagging on the fetid water, I rolled down my window. Raindrops from outside pelted my face, and something clicked. A sudden, terrible question. When I'd peered into the darkened interior, I hadn't been able to see who was inside the car. "Hey," my brother said, apparently struck by the same thought. "You're not foreseeing our deaths, are you?" I don't know if it was fate that caused us to fishtail just as he spoke, but also he may have hit something because there was a bump. All I know is suddenly we were flying, off the road and over the side toward a lake, and then plunging. And I snatched for his hand as the impact slammed us forward into the dashboard. Then the water wasn't just in my mind. It was real. It was pouring in through the car window. I fought, flailing, unbuckled, floundered through the half-open window. Luckily, I was still small enough to get through, swimming up and breaking the surface. "Corey? Corey!" But I knew already that my brother wasn't coming up. His hand had been cold when I touched it. Naturally, his death feels like my fault. In kinder moments, I remember that I was a child, and try to forgive myself for letting him get behind that wheel. But for a time, I was driven by the fierce need to atone. I sought desperately to save even one life, any life. I'd see a body swaying from a beam in a construction site. Legs dangling from the trunk of a car on the highway in front of me. A suitcase on sale in a luggage store, dripping blood. Every time, I tried to prevent the death, only to fail, or worse, cause it. Each loss drove home more deeply my shame, my failure, until, eventually, I gave up. I don't try to prevent the deaths anymore. These days I catch a whiff of that familiar, sickly, putrid scent, and I leave. I avoid human touch, especially handshakes. I've truly become wallpaper. Able to see, powerless to prevent. My name, incidentally, is Cassandra. I changed it because I could no longer bear my birth name. If hope is the thing with feathers, I was an angel of death, harbinger of doom to my brother and others. So instead, I call myself after the Greek priestess doomed to foresee the future, but never to be believed. Unable to prevent even one single tragedy. But let's get back to the cruise. The missing passengers. The eyeballs in the thermos. Oh, those grisly details. Mind you, once you know, you can't unknow. No matter how much you drink or smoke, or however you drown your despair. Speaking of drowning, a month ago today, I hit the big 4-0. I celebrated my 4 decades of life by doing the one thing I've done consistently since I was old enough. Drinking away my failures. Every icy grip, every unheeded warning, and especially those times I've well and truly fucked up. Oh yes, those are the ones that call for some hard forgetting. I was on my 2nd, or 7th, drink at my favorite bar when a voice exclaimed, "Evening, friend." A woman with shimmering purple eyeliner and matching purple hair approached. It was the musician who often played there, Lily Tsuki. To be honest, she was the primary reason I frequented that bar, though we'd hardly spoken beyond my occasional compliments about her playing. She slid into the seat next to mine and clinked my glass. "Roy at the bar told me it's your 40th. I see you in here once a week. Always tipping well and drinking like you're trying to drown yourself. Someone did something kind for me recently, so I'm trying to pass it on." She fished a hand into her pocket and, to my surprise, produced a gift card for a cruise. I didn't catch all of her story in the noisy bar, but apparently one of her admirers was very rich. Always offering her gifts verging on the inappropriate. After finding out she'd be playing on the Azure Sea Star, said admirer sent her the card so she could spoil herself on the cruise. She didn't feel comfortable accepting, so she gifted it to me. "There's enough on there to cover your fare. Don't thank me, thank you. I needed to get rid of it. Enjoy your 40th, friend." As she handed me the card, her fingers brushed mine. Warm. Alive. I mumbled my thanks, cheeks warm. Why? Because she chose me? Blushes? I'm an idiot. Still, I was glowing, and not just because I was tipsy. Why not? Why not treat myself this once? The Azure Sea Star. It sounded like a dream. I'd go see Lily Tsuki play at the piano bar against the backdrop of a glimmering ocean. I'd drink under the stars, get a tan, get my sea legs. And every hand would be warm, and every breath would taste of the summer breeze. 9 decks, 11 including the crew-only levels. Over 1,000 people. Pools, bars, restaurants, lounges, cafes, spas, cabaret. The Sea Star truly was the Ritz-Carlton on the water. I was absolutely giddy. Of course, before the luxury came the wait. Just like the airport, parking, luggage, ticketing, security. It was when I neared the entrance for ticketing, enjoying the summer breeze, that I caught the traces of a sour odor. A whiff of decay. So faint beneath the car exhaust and smell of the salt water that I might have missed it, were I not attuned to death. At port, it was likely an unfortunate animal packed into a shipping crate and decomposing. I'd even read horror stories of people trafficked in sealed shipping containers and asphyxiating. That faint whiff made my insides curdle. Then I was inside the air-conditioned terminal, packed with passengers, and inhaling nothing but the blessed AC. The check-in was surprisingly quick. I followed the embarkation signs up the escalator to the terminal's upper level. Through the double glass doors, greeted on my right by printed images of pool decks and steaks and wine glasses. On my left, through the enormous paned wall of glass, the sea star herself loomed. My God, she was enormous. So many decks, so many balconies. Then I squinted a little closer. What was that speck? A tiny figure, draped on a railing. My heart dropped to my toes. Something was horribly wrong. The figure, small against the massive width of the ship, had no face. Only a torso and most of its arms. It had been decapitated, and dried blood splattered the rail. My footsteps slowed. I pressed against the glass, eyes rapidly roving the rest of the ship. Was it just one incidence of violence, or... Perhaps I wasn't seeing correctly. It was a stunt. A practical joke, a mannequin. I needed to get closer. I hurried along the terminal, joining the line out to the gangplank. The bowl of the sky had turned deep purple, the sun lowering towards the horizon, and in the sea star's deep shadow, the temperature dropped. A sudden chill gripped me as I trotted out onto the gangplank. I sniffed. Sniffed again, more deeply. Rot. The same putrid odor I'd caught outside. A passenger ahead of me noticed me grabbing my nose and remarked, "Not used to that ocean smell?" I did not respond, because now that I was close enough to see the ship more clearly, I noticed. Cracked glass. Broken panes in the sliding glass doors of the cabins. No! I gasped, sinking to my knees, and the passenger kindly leaned to help me up. As her hand seized mine, it was cold. I jerked back so fast I actually collapsed into the passenger behind us. A mother and her daughter. My hand brushed the daughter's bare arm. Cold. "Are you okay?" asked the daughter, a child of about 12. I crawled back from her, and another person, an elderly gentleman, leaned down to help me up, his hand on my elbow. Cold. "Miss?" he asked. "Miss?" But I bolted, barely hearing their cries as I launched myself back towards the terminal. No. My eyes watered, and my belly bunched into knots, and my heart lurched into my throat, and oh God, the ship! The whole entire ship! It was dark. Windows broken. Not a single light shining in the interior. And spatters of blood here and there visible on its decks and balconies. But worst of all was the smell. I hadn't even entered the ship yet, and I already knew, in the way only I can know, that the smell wasn't just one body or two, Not if I could detect it all the way out on the gangplank. All the way out at the entrance to the terminal. For the whiff of putrefaction to have spread so far, the source was something massive. A colossal pile of decomposing bodies like a herd of dead elephants. That ship. No one on that ship was going to make it back. As I entered the terminal with its blessed filtered air and the windows between me and the ship, I turned and looked at the lines stretching behind me. Passengers laughing, chatting, dressed in their finest, flirting, teasing, buzzing with excitement, old and young couples, children. Everyone on this ship is going to die. And I'm the only one who knows. Imagine walking into a burning building, and everyone laughs and tells you the fire's all in your head. When no one believes you, are you going to stay to burn with them? Every passenger in that crowd waiting to embark on the luxury cruise was already dead. They just didn't know it yet. I stared through the windows of the terminal at the magnificent sea star, at the broken glass and spatters of blood that only I could see. And then I fled. Without warning a single soul. What would have been the point? My name is Cassandra. I see death 6 days before it happens, and can feel it if I shake a cold hand. But no matter what I do, I can never, ever prevent it. My flight took me as far as the escalators before a flash of purple brought me screeching to a halt. Lily? No, it wasn't the purple-haired musician who'd gifted me the cruise gift card. But suddenly I remembered how I'd been looking forward to hearing her performance aboard this very vessel. Oh, God. It was one thing to turn my back on doomed strangers. Terrible as it sounds, it's a bit like reading about a catastrophe in the news. Quite another thing to abandon someone I knew. Could I really leave her to become one of the bodies putrefying in the belly of the sea star? Every time I ordered a drink at my favorite bar, I'd remember I hadn't even tried to save her. Fuck. Oh, fuck me sideways. How much time? 90 minutes. 90 minutes to get on board, find the musician, and... what? Convince her to disembark? How? And yet, my feet were already turning towards the gangplank. Because, as it turns out, I would rather plunge headlong into a ship full of the rotting dead than face an empty piano bench, and the guilt that no amount of alcohol would ever drown. But to have any chance at persuading Lily, I'd need to know how the passengers died. This meant that in addition to finding a purple-haired needle in a Titanic-sized haystack, a horrifying task loomed ahead of me. I was going to have to do something I had not done in a very long time. Plunge directly into my vision. Walk into its very maw and face whatever gruesome horrors lurked at the source of that nauseating odor. I was going to have to find the bodies and whatever killed them.
Boarding.
The stench was so overpowering after crossing the gangplank that I dropped to my knees and dry heaved. The flow of passengers moved around me past the concierge desk. I must have looked exceptionally sick because a pretty girl in a suit skirt approached, asking if I needed assistance. She reached out a hand to help me up. Cold. I staggered away from her and inside. Then, because I felt I might throw up, quickly found my way out to the promenade deck in the blessed breeze. Lifeboats hung overhead. Beyond the rail, the sea sparkled in the afternoon sun. Cushioned loungers lined the deck. None were in use, presumably because the pool, patio, spa, and other amenities on the upper decks had much more attractive areas for lounging. I leaned against the rail and gulped the air, listening to the waves splash against the side of the boat, noting blood spatters further down, but nothing signifying the cause of the blood. Just vague signs of violence. After circling the entire promenade deck and spotting only the occasional blood spatterings, I gritted my teeth, pulled my shirt collar up over my nose, and plunged into the nearest door. The Sea Star's interior had the atmosphere of a luxury hotel. People milled about the restaurant and shopping areas, buzzing with excitement, talking about cabaret shows and fine dining, while perky crew members answered questions, all perfectly oblivious to the putrid, sweet, rotting stench. I'd most likely find Lily at the piano lounge, but since I didn't have any plausible explanation for what had happened to the passengers, I continued wandering, entering a bustling cafe overlooking the ship's grand staircase. Stepping over an enormous bloodstain on the carpet, I passed the counter, nauseated by the fancy pastries behind their glass cases, peering among the tables and chairs. Paused when I spotted an eyeball in a teacup. No trace of how it got there. No body with an empty socket. Just the eyeball, swirling in a congealed bloody jelly at the bottom of a cup. I scurried away, snatching a cloth napkin to cover my nose. The interior darkened as I ascended the central staircase. No electricity. I noted as I clutched the railing. Why would the power be cut? A storm? But storms don't scoop out eyeballs with a dessert spoon. Coming onto deck 6, I peered down a long, dim corridor lined with passenger cabins. To passengers coming and going, the hall was illuminated by electric lighting. But since I was seeing the ship 6 days in the future, the narrow hallway vanished into blackness. With no way to enter the cabins, and nothing much to see here or on the other dimmed halls of the passenger decks, I ascended until I reached the pool.
Pool deck.
Deck 9 opened to wide panoramic windows, dining, a spa, and of course, the pool. I emerged outdoors with relief, removing the napkin from my nose as the sea breeze gave some respite from the odor. Around me, people partied in bikinis and beachwear and suits, sipping all manners of drinks around the sky-blue swimming pool. A young woman stretched on a blood-spattered lounger, oblivious to the gore beneath her tanned figure. A few bodies floated among the swimmers, bloated and discolored. My vision shimmered briefly as a teen boy swam right through one of the bodies, splashing as if it were not there. My heart lurched when I realized that it was his own, albeit dressed in different clothes. Oof! I grunted as a small figure bashed into me, her arm grazing mine. "Sorry," cried a little girl in a pink swimsuit, bolting by as her mother yelled at her to watch out for people. I tried not to think of how cold the little girl's arm felt. Counted the bodies. 8 in the pool, 1 by the towel bin, head caved in. I made a circuit of the pool, occasionally brushing against people. Cold, cold, cold. No survivors, it seemed. But why? That was when I spotted a shirtless old man sitting at a table under an umbrella. I froze, goosebumps prickling along my skin. Unlike the floaters, there was no obvious reason for his death. His back was to me, the bare skin of his shoulders gray and blotchy. In his hand, he held a broken drinking glass. He was positioned in repose. So, what killed him? My heart quickened as I moved round to the front of him. His mouth hung open, shards of glass and a mangled tongue lolling out. Crimson trailing down his chest. The source of the chewed glass was obvious. The cup in his hand was broken, its jagged edges bloody. He'd died choking on the glass. What the fuck is happening here?
Forward stairwell.
The jogging track and the sun deck, decks 10 and 11, offered a stunning bird's-eye view of the pool and the ocean. But I did not stop to take this in as I circled to the bow, opting to take the forward stairs down rather than the central. The stench hit me like a cloud. I had to stop as I descended into the dim stairwell, clinging to the railing, doubled over, gagging. It was so bad. My eyes watered, my stomach bucked, and it was dark. Thank God for my phone's flashlight. I fumbled it on, and, napkin firmly over my nose, plunged down into the depths. The phone's thin illumination flashed along the carpeted stairwell in the hall of the first passenger decks. I kept descending. Paused at an unidentifiable slick red mound. I was examining it under my light when a crew member jogged up to me and asked, "Lose something, miss?" "Just my marbles." I muttered, shooing the crew member away and inadvertently brushing his hand. Cold. I turned my attention back to the mound. A slimy pile of intestines on the stairwell, trailing down to a disemboweled body. Intestines. Eyeballs. Eating broken glass. Nothing about this makes sense. I swiveled the beam to check further downward. That was when I found the source of the odor. My path down was obstructed by a mass of bodies. The ones underneath seemed to have been trampled, but the ones on top... I squeezed my watering eyes and retched against the wall. Some of the bodies bore horrible mutations. Fingers bent and twisted, joints out of alignment, faces smashed in and jaws torn open. Many more appeared to have been crushed in the press of bodies. Best guess, there was a wave of panicked people rushing upstairs from below, colliding with the wave of others fleeing down from above. Why this staircase? What was near this part of the ship? The cabaret lounge, I realized. No electricity, no elevators. This was the nearest stairwell to the auditorium. Closer. I was inching closer to uncovering the fates of the passengers, and yet I still had no idea what the passengers were fleeing from. Who were the attackers? Or... I thought of the eyeball. The glass chewed and swallowed. An icy pinprick at the base of my skull whispered the question I didn't want to ask. Why? Why did some of the passengers go mad and do it to themselves?
Piano bar.
I took the long way to the cabaret theater, going all the way back up the stairs and coming down the central staircase, only to detour on hearing the notes of a piano. I found myself in a cozy lounge and spotted a purple-haired figure at the keys. And just in time. The ship was due to depart in less than half an hour. Lily! I rushed over. The musician's face lit.
Oh, it's you, friend. You made it.
You've got to get off the ship.
Off the
I know it seems crazy, but you've got to. Everyone on board is going to die. I've seen it because I'm psycho. I heard it a second later and smacked my forehead. I mean psychic. Psychic! I can see the future. At her scrunched eyebrows, I burst. Look, I know how I sound, but I've been able to see things since I was a little girl. And I am telling you, this ship is going to go dark. The engines will cut out. People are going to flee and trample each other on that forward staircase. Launching into a rapid-fire recounting, I was just getting to the eyeball in the teacup when she interrupted.
You're afraid of some sort of terrorist attack?
No. It's almost like a kind of madness, a contagion that spreads through the ship.
A zombie apocalypse?
Not zombies.
Poltergeist. Possession.
She played a riff from a horror movie.
Should we call an exorcist?
We should leave. I checked my phone.
Quickly! What an odd duck you are. I can't imagine any sort of catastrophe as big as you're saying. You know this ship has tons of safety protocols. And even if I did believe some disaster were drawing near, do you really think I could abandon crowds and crew?
She looked at me over her glasses, shimmering purple lips curving into a smile.
Listen, friend. If this were the Titanic and I was the only one who could see the iceberg, I'd stay to steer us right, not run off leaving everyone to die.
Icy fingers raked along my spine. Even if she wasn't taking me seriously, she was right. I did have a moral obligation to save people. An obligation I'd been trying to fulfill ever since I was a little girl. Until the attempt killed my brother, and even after. I kept trying for years and years, until I realized that there is no way to change anything. That is why I call myself Cassandra. For the Greek prophet doomed to predict the future but never be believed. Try and prevent what I've foreseen? You might as well try and pluck the stars from the sky. Every hand I'd touched was cold. Everyone on board would die. My fists balled, fingernails digging so hard into my palms they bled. You really have no idea what you're asking of me.
Oh, I'm not telling you to stay. I'm just explaining why I have to. Besides, I'm under contract.
She winked and focused on her playing as guests entered and sat at nearby tables. She had no idea. None whatsoever. If I thought there was even a sliver of a hope, I wouldn't abandon people. Oh, if this happy-go-lucky musician understood the futility. But she will. Came another darker thought. She will know the full depth of the horror coming. No.
Huh? Wait, friend. Where are you going?
But I was not listening. The cabaret theater. Was the answer there? The reason for the crush of bodies in the forward stairwell. I rushed past the cafe with the eyeball in the teacup, through the grand doors, into the cabaret hall. But the cabaret hall was surprisingly quiet. A few passengers mingled here or there, unnoticing of the cadavers draped on chairs and tables. The stage itself was pristine. The wood smooth and polished in the fading orange light through the windows. Apparently, the origin of the panicked flight up the forward stairwell was not this grand entertainment venue. Nothing here supported that theory. Nonetheless, I gave the place a thorough search until my phone's battery ran low, and then I returned to the grand staircase. In one direction lay passenger cabins. In the other, the gangplank back to the port terminal. And safety. It's not too late to be a coward, Cass. Run from the ship. Run from the empty piano bench at the bar. Find a different, cheaper hole in the wall to crawl into like the cockroach you are. Always the survivor, eh? Or I could try just one more time. Hope, my brother always said, is the thing with feathers. And look what happened to him! Flashed through my mind. My heart slammed against my rib cage. I'd just die too, unless I left in the next how many minutes? I checked my phone, but it was dead, like I would be if I stayed. A horn sounded the Sea Star's departure. A distant cheer rose up from the upper decks and balconies. I felt a brief, panicky impulse to run back out on deck and throw myself off the ship. But in truth, my fate had already been decided before the ship's horn blew. I hadn't been paying attention earlier, but I'd been rubbing and rubbing my hands, and finally realized they were cold. Probably had been since I boarded. I shuffled leaden feet toward the passenger cabins, feeling along the brass number plates until I reached 4044. My cabin. Reached for the knob and stopped. That smell. Dread squeezed my intestines like a wet rag. Smoke. Burnt meat. I wrinkled my nose and opened the door. Orange rays shone through the window. The sunset so vivid it almost gave the illusion that the room was on fire. The walls and ceiling were charred. The edges of the mattress and sheets a smoldered ruin. The worst damage was the small sofa by the coffee table. Broken bottles scattered around. And there, on the sofa, my fingers went limp on the door handle as I stared into melted sockets of a body charred beyond recognition. A dark line encircled its wrist, the blackened remnants of a charm bracelet. My bracelet. While the man on the pool deck swallowed glass, I would succumb to the insanity here, dousing myself in alcohol and flame, burning myself alive. I've seen bodies mashed, crushed, dismembered, stuffed into suitcases, blackened like meat on a grill, floating, bloating, with flies swarming their flesh and maggots wriggling out of their eyes. I have, in short, an intimacy with death. But nothing prepared me for the horror in cabin 4044. I stared at my own smoldering corpse, into the blackened sockets of my melted eyes, and ice racked my spine and splintered my bones, shivering all the way down to my frozen fingertips. You knew this day would come, whispered a voice in my head. And then, as my nose wrinkled, ugh, I smell like bacon. Giggles. Ah, dear. Not beneficial. Couldn't I try to approach my death with some dignity? No? Well, fine. Ignoring my own bubbling hysteria, I held my napkin over my nostrils and leaned in. Cross-legged in a lotus position, hands cradled and thumbs touching. Crispy me held the pose of a meditating monk. From the liquor bottles scattered around the burnt wreckage, as well as the pose, I'd started the fire myself. But what induced such madness? Glowing white light suddenly emanated from the blackened sockets. I gasped, tumbling backwards over the coffee table. When I sat up, the light was gone. It did not reappear during the half hour I charged my phone, keeping one leery eye on my corpse while I used the ship's spotty Wi-Fi for research.
A mysterious contagion.
According to Google, the worst cruise disaster in modern times involved the partial capsizing of a vessel after a captain's error led to a rock tearing open the hull. Of the 4,000 passengers, 34 drowned. Another ship, infamously dubbed the Poop Cruise, had its engines catch fire and the passengers were stranded for nearly a week on board without electricity or toilet facilities. However, the Sea Star was not destined for any ocean or weather-related incident, but rather a contagion. And while coronavirus and norovirus have both afflicted cruise ships in recent years, no virus, not even rabies, could explain the self-mutilation. To say nothing of the virulence. A mortality rate of 100%. That was unheard of in nature. There should be some survivors, if only by happenstance. Or is it because? A terrible chill spread up the flesh of my arms, and a thought lodged like an ice pick in my skull. What if the doom of the Azure Sea Star isn't happenstance, but deliberate? Are there no survivors because someone doesn't want there to be? Numb at the implication, I sat down my phone. But how? Why? 1,000 passengers and crew? If there was someone planning such a disaster, how would I identify them? And why would anyone commit such an atrocity? My gut tightened, and I got up and ventured out to the upper decks.
Deck 9.
Cold, cold, cold. The chill in my bones deepened with each hand I brushed. Passengers glared as I fumbled around, dismissing me as either blind or mentally feeble. The blindness was somewhat accurate. I couldn't see under the electric lighting in the swanky interior, since my eyes were seeing 6 days in the future, when the Sea Star would be plunged into a blackout. I depended on my phone's feeble flashlight as I navigated the sea of guests around the bar and lounge areas. But no matter how many arms and hands I bumbled into, cold. With no accidental survivors, I was becoming more and more convinced the Sea Star's doom must be deliberate. But I was still very much in the dark, literally and figuratively, about why. The most useful discovery of the evening came after my collision with a heavyset older man whose drink I spilled. Noticing me sweeping around my phone's pitiful beam and assuming I'd lost something, he offered to lend me a more powerful flashlight from his cabin. "It's one of those high-powered ones if you want it." He smiled, and I stared, every hair on my neck standing on end. Something on my face?" His smile turned into a confused frown under my phone's light. No, yes. A flashlight would be very helpful. Thank you. "This way. My name's John, by the way." His grin returned. Oh, God. I'd recognized him. Glass-chewing man. He had a name now. I am ashamed to admit that I tried not to speak to him too much on the way to his cabin, despite his doing me a kindness. It's so much harder to face death with names and histories attached. I remained standing outside his cabin door, looking incredibly guilty, as he emerged and set into my hand the flashlight. When I turned it on, it sent a floodlight straight down the corridor, one end to the other. In addition to this useful tool, the encounter brought a critical insight. His clothes. Glass chewing involved a different outfit. So, the catastrophe would not strike tonight.
Pool deck.
After brushing roughly 1 billion cold hands, as the overnight crowd began thinning, I took myself out to a lounger. Being unwilling to overnight in my cabin, wreathed in the fumes of my own char-grilled corpse, voices woke me up in the dead of the night. The moon and stars offered the only illumination over the pitch sea, and I shambled groggily to the rail. It struck me that the wind had died. The sea star was stationary. Out on the pale peaks of the waves, a rescue craft bobbed up and down.
Looks like some idiot went overboard.
Complained a voice behind me. A cluster of passengers had gathered. One, with the authority of an experienced cruiser, mentioned the possibility of a suicide jumper.
It shouldn't affect our itinerary much. These things happen at sea, you know. After the rescue, he or she, let's call them Passenger X, will be taken to the infirmary and monitored by security.
I didn't hear the rest of his words, because I was too busy smacking my forehead as I burst. The infirmary? Good fucking gracious, was my brain already barbecued? I suspected a contagion, yet hadn't thought to search the infirmary. Snatching up my flashlight, I headed downstairs, but the lower decks were cordoned off. A jovial crewman explained the passengers' access was restricted during rescue operations.
Also, it's 3 a.m.
He added, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup.
The infirmary will open, I think, around 8.
Which deck?
Deck 2.
He gladly explained the layout when I asked. The lower decks also included crew quarters, a crew lounge, mess hall, the engine room, kitchens, food storage, the highway, used for quickly trafficking trolleys from one end of the ship to the other, the infirmary, various machinery rooms, a brig, a morgue.
We mostly use it for like chillin' flowers and stuff like that, though.
He added with a grin. There was also a third staircase near the stern of the ship, the aft stairwell, used regularly only by staff, but open to passengers in case of emergency. As he rattled off this list, I could feel myself plunging deeper into despair. This ship was so enormous, and so much of what lay below was off-limit to passengers. Furthermore, there were no windows below. How was I even going to make my way in the blackout? Even with John's flashlight, the prospect was daunting. But first things first, Cass. The infirmary.
Infirmary.
At 8 a.m. sharp, I stepped into the infirmary. The waiting room was as ordinary as they come, complete with boring magazines and cheap office chairs and, because it was deep in the interior, pitch dark to my sleep-deprived eyes.
Morning, sweetie. How can I help you today?
The secretary at the front desk tipped her head toward me, revealing a glimpse of another face beneath my flashlight. Mouth gaping and mangled, every tooth pulled out. Blissfully unaware that she was sharing her chair with her own corpse, the secretary smiled and gave me a clipboard of paperwork for check-in. While I filled out the forms by flashlight, footsteps shuffled near the desk. The secretary struck up a conversation with somebody I assumed was a nurse. My ears pricked when they gossiped about last night.
Did you hear about the rescue? When they pulled him out of the water, he wasn't breathing.
I pretended to be engrossed in the forms.
As soon as they revived him, he started screaming and screaming.
Oh my god. Seriously?
Yeah, and he was like super aggressive. They had to sedate him.
Oh my god.
It's really weird. They're saying he might have come from another ship, and it might have been, like, days that he was out on the water.
So this passenger X, who was pulled in last night, had just been drifting out on the ocean? He wasn't a jumper? And he was screaming and screaming, like perhaps someone maddened. I was about to abandon my forms and search for this passenger X when the secretary all but gave me a heart attack by materializing in front of me out of the dark. She took the paperwork and informed me the nurse was ready. I was directed to a small examination room. One of 3, I noted, as I swept my beam around the infirmary. Examining tables, chairs, computers. No sign of any screaming passenger. Where would they have brought him? The nurse, a young woman in a hijab, asked me the typical questions, typing my responses into a computer with a cracked, dead screen. Is he all right? The man who was rescued? Was he drifting long? She responded pertly.
We're still trying to ascertain. But don't worry, he's being helped.
Her brows scrunched as she shone a light into each of my eyes. Of course, I forgot to warn her.
That's so strange. Are you wearing contact lenses?
No, my eyes are very black. Even under a flashlight, they don't reflect any light. They've been that way since I was 4 years old. I was dead for nearly an hour from drowning, but revived, and everything came back normal except for my eyes. I'd always believed my horrific visions were the result of my near-death experience. As if I wasn't supposed to come back, and brought a little bit of death with me, just in my eyes.
Whoa! What a wild story.
You have no idea. I replied, looking at her corpse peering out at me from under the examination table, all jammed around the base. A knock on the door cut our exam short before I could warn her. Not that it would have made any difference. She asked me to wait for a few moments and stepped outside. When she did not immediately return, I slipped away in search of passenger X.
Highway.
The moment I stepped out of the infirmary and away from the nearby elevator lounge, it became evident I'd left the passenger areas. All veneer of luxury was stripped away, leaving bare walls interrupted only by occasional stacks of boxes. The flashlight's wide beam swept along the massive corridor that I was guessing was the highway. My footsteps resounded on concrete. Nothing but sterile, windowless, white. Or at least it had been, once. I tried not to look too closely at the crimson streaking the walls or the corpses I stepped over. The origin of the contagion was definitely down here. Even through the napkin held over my nose, I could taste death here. Hello? What was this? In one section of the corridor, the walls and floor had rippled. Almost as if a shockwave had left indentations, bending and shattering the concrete. But what could have done that? The lights flickered. I froze. It wasn't my flashlight's beam. That remained steady. The lights, the overhead lights, flickered, casting the hall in blinking flashes of crimson streaks and white walls. Then, the lights came on. All the bodies vanished. Oh, I said, blinking against the sudden brightness. Oh. The smell was gone, too. No scent of death. Though there was something else. A strangely metallic, tangy smell. Like lightning and copper. I shut off my flashlight, turning a slow circle as I gawked at the stark white walls. The flat gray floor. The dazzling fluorescent lighting so bright it almost blinded me. It struck me that I was seeing the ship right now. Not 6 days in the future, but now. Before the blackout, before the outbreak. The same whitewashed hallway as all the other passengers saw. Why? What had happened to my vision? Had I lost my special sight? Or... Someone was standing in the corridor. I froze. The hairs on my neck prickled, and a knot of dread twisted my gut. The man stood halfway down the hallway, slouched and bedraggled. His clothes were crushed and faded, hanging off him like hangers of bone. His limp hair draped in messy curls around his unshaven face. And his eyes, those eyes, the same eyes I'd seen staring emptily from John's glass-chewing corpse, and from the mangled nurse under the table. All the dead have the exact same look in their eyes. One glance at those pale blue orbs. This man was dead. I was certain of it. Yet, he was standing. You are the passenger who... The dead man's lips spread, baring teeth in what might have been a sick imitation of a grin or a grimace. Hey. I jumped as a voice called out from behind me. An officer in a security uniform strode out from an unmarked door, eyes on the dead man. The security officer said,
Ma'am, stay back.
His gaze never left the dead man.
Sir, if you could please come with me.
No, don't! But the security officer was already marching forward, and the dead man's hands lifted in stiff parody of surrender. He turned and began shuffling away under the officer's escort. And then, his teeth bared. Suddenly, the dead man had his arm around the officer, mouth clamping on his ear as the officer howled. He was eating him. No. Tongue wriggling? Licking him? Whispering? The officer shoved the dead man aside and collapsed against the wall. I rushed forward, but skidded to a halt as the dead man's grinning face turned toward me. Terror seized me at the sudden realization that I was next. He took a wobbly step. The lights shut off. Swearing, I fumbled for my flashlight, switched on the beam, shrieked when it fell across a hand. But it was just the security officer reaching for me, asking,
Hey, are you all right, ma'am?
He winced, rubbing at his ear like a dog bothered by a whistle only it could hear. Then, he said into his phone,
He assaulted me and got away. I've got another passenger here.
The stench wafted back. Gore once again splattered the walls. I was once more seeing 6 days into the future, and clapped my napkin back to my mouth to stop myself from retching at the return of the smell. But I wasn't really thinking about all that. No, because my heart slammed my ribs and my breath ripped ragged from my throat, and every hair stood on end as if I'd been struck by lightning. Whatever it was the crew of the Sea Star had hauled from the ocean, it certainly hadn't been living when they rescued it. And the proof was in those overhead lights. Merely being in proximity to Passenger X, my vision had been pulled into the present. Like he was a magnet, drawing my sight into his field. But if death was the thing my black, lightless eyes usually glimpsed, then what exactly was Passenger X? And if he could affect my vision, not to mention animating a dead man's corpse, how was I going to have any hope of stopping him?